G'day YouTube, welcome to Drop Bear Moto. My name's Richard and today, as you know, we're talking about suspension. Really appreciate you clicking on that because not the best topic when it comes to motorcycles. We all want loud pipes, we want horsepower, we want to be talking about that sort of stuff. But suspension is really important. Couple of big reasons. One, you don't want to be riding down the road leaking spinal fluid everywhere every time you hit a big bump, unless you're a hardtail chopper guy. For me, I would need to be wearing a kidney belt on one of those things. The other thing you don't want to do is be like an old Cadillac land yacht just floating down the road, right? We spoke about power before. To put that power down, we want these tyres to be in contact with the road as much as possible. That's obviously how you get traction on a motorcycle. That's how you're going to be able to turn, steer. It's where you get grip. So you want those tyres in contact with the road as much as possible, and probably set up suspension is going to maximise the time those tyres are spent on the tarmac and not floating around in the air. So super critical when you've got two wheels, two tyres as compared to a car with four. We are going to be talking about the Scout 101 because it has fully adjustable suspension, which is pretty trick for the Scout range and new. So this is going to be a very basic video to talk about how to dial in those adjustments. So really an introductory level kind of overview. I guess you could call it Suspension 101 for your 101 Scout. Boom. Sorry, had to be done. Other cruisers do have these adjustments though. We're not talking about dirt bikes or race setups, we're just talking about what you'll find in a cruiser. So a lot of these concepts will equate across other motorcycles. One big one is preload we're going to talk about. To me, it's actually criminal that your dealer doesn't set your preload for you as a rider before you take that motorcycle out of there. So this will apply definitely to the full Scout range, but preload is really important and most motorcycles do have preload suspension adjustments. You should really always get that set for you on every motorcycle you have, so definitely stay tuned for that piece. We are only going to talk about the adjustments you can make on this Scout though. You can, with suspension, it's a slippery slope, and to me it gets very quickly like voodoo or black magic. You can talk about different types of fork oil, different springs, and all those sort of things. So if you are an expert, please weigh in on the comments on anything else you want to add to this video. It'll help us all learn. I'm not a suspension expert, as I say, I just know a little enough to be dangerous. So let's check it out. So the 101 does have several levels of adjustment in the suspension. I spoke about preload, but we're also going to talk about compression and rebound, and dampening is what those two things do. So what we're going to do is talk about the concepts of what they all mean. Then we're going to show you how to make the adjustments on the motorcycle. First of all, we'll do preload on the rear, then preload on the front. Then we're going to talk about dampening and again, start with the rear, move to the front. So when we look at suspension, let's go around to the rear shocks here. There's two main parts to the suspension. One obviously is the spring that we have here, and the second piece then is the oil in this shock. And the two work together. If you just had a spring, once it bounced, it would keep bouncing. So the shock actually helps it settle back quickly and keep contact with the road. One of the great things, first of all, about this shock is that we have a piggyback, what we call piggyback rear suspension. Basically what that means is that it's keeping the oil away from the shock. So if you've got repeated use of the shock, it's keeping it cooler and therefore better performance. So that's why you see this setup on a lot of motorcycles these days in the performance cruiser world. Okay, there's a couple of tools you will need for this job. The main one for the rear suspension is the tool, the sort of spanner wrench that came with the bike. You're going to need that for the rear suspension. For the front suspension, you're going to need a 17mm spanner and a flathead screwdriver. You'll also need something to measure with. I use millimeters in this video, purely because I don't know what 0.1 of an inch is, being from Australia. So I always go back to millimeters when I'm doing measurements like this. You'll also need some sort of Sharpie or Nico pen, whatever you want to call it. Some light lubricant oil, couple of cloths, also a towel to protect the tank. The other thing we're going to do is I'm going to make a tool. I'll show you when it's on the bike, but I've just measured out the 282 millimeters that I need in a piece of cardboard, and I've cut away a center section for the spring to fit around. Show you in a minute how that works. Once you've got your tools ready, there are a few things you're going to need to be able to do this. First of all, make sure you've got your tyres at the right pressure. On this particular Scout, that's 36 PSI on the front, 40 on the rear. So really important to have that set up right from the beginning. Second of all, you're going to need the bike stood upright on its own. So I'm using a front wheel clamp here so we can stand that tyre up. But it's really important to make sure that a rider can sit on the motorcycle with no weight touching the ground. You don't want feet down. You really don't want to do this with just a stand down. Maybe at a push you could kind of sit on the bike and sort of hold yourself on the wall. But you're definitely going to need to make sure that there's no weight on there to get the best result. You're going to need the rider of the motorcycle and the passenger, if there usually is a passenger on the motorcycle or you're setting up to ride with one, plus any luggage or weight you'd normally take. That includes riding gear, so your helmet, jacket if you wear one, whatever you wear on the motorcycle normally, that's best to set it up. So this is definitely a two-person job, but if you've got a passenger as well, it's a three-person job. So we're going to talk about the spring part of the suspension first. And the way I think about a spring, like any sort of spring, obviously, the more that spring is compressed, the harder it is then to compress it more. So what we want to do is get that spring set up for your weight on the motorcycle. So if you're riding two up, you're probably going to want that spring compressed down a fair way, because the weight you have on is going to push it more. So you want to be in that higher sort of compression area. If you're lighter, you want that spring longer because it's going to take more of your weight to push it down. This is the part that I say all of the Scout range has, is adjustable preload in the rear shocks. So first of all, we're going to show you how to set that preload in the rear shocks. So we can think about preload as adding preload or taking preload away. One concept we're always going to be talking about when it comes to suspension on the 101 is when we want to add, it's going to be clockwise. When we want to take away or reduce, it's going to be anti-clockwise. So to increase the springs, we're going to turn the collar clockwise, and to decrease the springs and add more preload, we're going to turn anti-clockwise. The goal here, as I said, is we want the suspension to be firm enough to absorb the bumps, but not soft enough that the bike's going to bottom out. So that's what we're aiming for. The factory always give standards for this, and on this particular, on the Indian Scout, and this is for all models in the range, you measure from the middle of this bolt at the top here to the middle of this bolt down the bottom. So you want to sort of get some way of measuring between the two, and that's how you're going to set up your suspension. Now, I've seen all sorts of ways to do this. Obviously, you can just use a ruler, a tape measure, but one of the handy ways I find is to mark out a cardboard template. Because this spring does get in the way, we could use something like this to put over the shock as we've got it on the bike and be able to measure it this way. So we just cut out a little bit for the spring to set in, and you obviously want to measure from this point here to here. What we're shooting for with the rider on the bike, on the stand, with the correct tyre pressure, is 282 millimeters. That's actually 11.1 inches. So the 282 millimeters is for all of the Indian Scouts with the 3-inch suspension. When we say 3-inch suspension, that means the travel that the shock has, basically the silver bar in the middle there. So you'll often hear about people talk about sag in motorcycles, and there's two parts to sag. One is free sag and one is rider sag. So with this bike, if there was no weight on the tyre at all, if we had the bike actually lifted up in the air or with a jack underneath, and there was no load on that tyre and there was no preload on the shock, you would see 3 inches in the silver space between the shock, on the shaft of the shock. So there's a 3-inch suspension on here. That's free sag. The reason I say that is all of the motorcycles in the Scout range do have that 3-inch suspension, except the Bobber. The Bobber has a 2-inch suspension. That's why it's sort of slammed suspension. With the Bobber, 278 millimeters. That's 10.9 inches. So the measurement will be different on the Bobber, but the way we go about this will be exactly the same on all the motorcycles. Because we've got two shocks on the rear of the motorcycle, one on each side of the bike, we've got to make sure that both shocks are perfectly measured out the same. So everything we're going to do on this shock, we're going to split over the other side and do straight after. What we're going to be doing is adjusting these rings here. We're going to be moving them around with the sort of spanner wrench tool that Indian gives you with the motorcycle. So a couple of things I like to do to prep, because of all the road grime that can get up in the shock. First of all is to give the bike a good clean in the thread so that they're going to spin freely. Second thing is I like to put a little bit of lubricant or light oil just on the bottom collar here on the top of the spring. Because that's going to be compressing the spring down, it's nice to again have that move freely. If you do that, make sure you don't get any near the brakes at all, the drive belt or anything like that. So be really careful with any lubricant on the back end of the bike here. So let's get this cleaned up. Let's put a little bit of oil on here and then we'll go grab our rider. So you do want your rider, as I mentioned, with all their gear on the motorcycle. If that's you, you'll need someone to do the measuring part I'm about to do. So Mrs. DBM, we're going to set the bike up for her. She's got a helmet, the gloves, all the gear that she would normally wear when she's riding. So if we go around the back, we can see now using our measuring tool that we're just a little bit out when we look at the center here. So what we're going to do is loosen this top lock nut off. You've got two nuts on here. This is the lock nut, the top one, and the bottom one's the adjuster nut. So what we want to do is back this off. Think about looking down the shock from the top. We want to run this in an anti-clockwise motion to back it off. And you can see that there. If we break it loose, you'll be able to spin that one freely and run it all the way up to the top. Now we're going to play with the adjuster nut to actually set the suspension. So if we get our measurement again, we can see here that we just need to extend from where I am now. We need to go extend this shock out a little bit. So we want to move this adjuster nut up. To do that, we're going to have to go anti-clockwise, again looking down from the top, and to add, to bring the nuts closer together or reduce the gap there, we want to go clockwise. So let's spend a bit of time now. I'm just going to keep moving this bolt around, keep measuring until we get the right length between those two nuts. And you can see the difference. We've moved this shock now. It's almost all the way up to the top when we look and when we measure from center to center. We can see, oops, I don't know if that'll show in the fisheye lens, but we're pretty much now lined up center to center with that 282 millimeters. What we have to do next then is pull this lock nut back down, and again to do that we go clockwise this time. We'll wind that back down and clamp the adjuster nut back in place. And when we've got the lock nut down firmly onto the adjuster nut, make sure that's nice and tight in place. On the rear we do have two shock absorbers, one on each side. And whatever we're going to do on one side, we need to make sure we do exactly the same on the other side of the shock. So definitely repeat everything and make sure these two shocks are completely the same. So the front suspension is a little different from the rear. Again, first of all, we're going to do the preload. When we think about the front suspension, we have forks. We have two forks, obviously, either side. Setting the preload on the front forks is going to be a little bit different. Unfortunately, it's going to involve a little bit of math. I'm going to have to pull out a whiteboard here, which I thought I would never do on Drop Bear Moto. So we're going to adjust the preload on the front shocks, just on the left shock, using this top bolt here. The reason that it's only on one of the shocks and not both is the system sits together. And first of all, when I started to see this on motorcycles, I was a bit confused, like how can you have one that's out and the other one isn't? But when you think about the front suspension, we've got the shocks held together through the axle, then on the lower triple clamp, and then again on the upper triple clamp. So with those 3 points together, the suspension will act as one unit. It will all sit together and move together. So the adjustment for this is only in the left shock, and then we've got the adjustments for rebound and compression in the right shock. On the rear shock, we spoke about the exposed shaft of the suspension being 3 inches. I'm going to swap back to millimeters here On the front suspension, if the forks were fully extended, again, if this wheel was just hanging in the air with no load, the full extension of this cylinder here would be 120 millimeters. So quick drawing here, we want to think about that as a full extension of 120 millimeters. For road use, we normally talk about preload consuming 30 to 35% of that 120 millimeters, or 1/3 of that full suspension travel. So let me show you how to calculate that. So if we calculate 33%, let's just say, of that 120 millimeters, it's going to be 39.6 millimeter is the reduction we want to see on this part of the fork here. So to do the calculation, 39.6 millimeter is actually what's going to pop up inside the sleeve here. So if we subtract 39.6 from 120 millimeters, we end up with 80.4 millimeters. So what we're shooting to achieve here is measuring the distance on this extended shock here, or extended fork, sorry, I should say, from the bottom of the collar there all the way down to the top of the black piece here. We're basically shooting with the rider, all the luggage on the motorcycle, to get to an 80.4 millimeter gap there. So we're going to measure that a couple of ways. Again, you're going to need to have your rider with all their gear on the bike. Now the best way to do this is actually with an extension on your socket with a 17mm bit. So normally this would sit on the nut, and one full turn is what we refer to the socket going all the way around. So we talk about the number of turns we're changing. Now, because we're measuring, it doesn't matter so much, but I like to still adjust by one turn as we go. The reason I can't use this is the longest extension piece I have, and because we lifted the bars on this one up, it won't actually clear and do a full turn. So I'm going to go back to using a regular wrench. So the first thing I want to do, because I'm using a traditional wrench, is to throw a cover over the tank here so we don't scratch anything as we move. What I'm going to do is decrease the preload, similar to we had on the rear shocks, by taking this all the way out, so anti-clockwise until we hit the stop. I'm just going to mark at the top here. I could also just mark here so that I know where one full turn is as I'm turning that around. So this has 10 turns total in the adjustment on the left-hand fork here for preload. So we're shooting for 80.4 when we measure the motorcycle at the front here. Now, because the suspension settles different ways, we're going to take two measurements. We're going to compress the suspension first and let it come up and take our measurement. Now we're going to lift the motorcycle, let it settle down. So the reason we took those two measurements is to get an average to see how that bike settles each way. So if you took one measurement at 90 millimeters, the other one at 95 millimeters, you know that you're an average of 92.5 millimeters. So when we got that measurement, we were actually sitting at 81 millimeters with those shocks with all the preload removed or reduced. So we were full at the stop on anti-clockwise. That's pretty close to what we're chasing, and obviously we can't go any further, so we've left it there for Mrs. DBM's setup. Hopefully you're with me so far. That was the most complicated part of today. So now we're going to talk about damping, not to be confused with dampening. I said that earlier in the video. Dampening would be what you do to your cloth to clean your bike. Damping is when we talk about suspension. And there's two parts to damping. That's your rebound and your compression. We spoke earlier about if the spring was on its own, it would just keep bouncing down the road. And we spoke about the shock, or the oil in the shock, that actually stops the oscillation of that spring happening. That's what damping is. The first aspect of damping is compression. Compression is what happens when the suspension compresses. So the wheel comes up, you've hit a bump, or you've hit the brakes and the wheel comes up. So we're talking about for compression, how fast that wheel comes up. Rebound is how fast the wheel comes back down. So if we do hit a bump in a corner, we want the wheel to come back down and get on the road as quickly as possible. But again, both of these settings can be pretty jarring if we have them up high. Let's talk a little bit about how do you know if you need more or less damping. The level of damping you have on your motorcycle is very personal and also depends on how the riding conditions. So hard for me to recommend settings here, but it's an easy way to get in and have some fun and explore. Let's talk about compression first of all. So if your bike feels very harsh, if you're got a lot of shaking coming through the steering wheels, if you ride on very rough roads, then you're going to want to reduce the compression and go to a lower value. On the flip side, if your bike sort of dives really heavily when you're under braking, or if you come through a turn, it kind of feels like it's going to bottom out, then you want to increase the compression. For rebound, if you go through some bumps or bumpy road and your bike seems to sort of pogo or it feels loose or not connected, then you want to increase the rebound. On the other side, if you're not feeling that your wheel's getting back to the ground quick enough after a bump, like particularly if you go over a series of bumps, we sort of call that packing down. If you're feeling that you're not getting the traction back on the road quick enough, then you want to reduce the rebound setting. As we go through setting up the damping, I would think about a syringe. If you have a syringe with a larger hole, it's very easy to push the fluid through. And if you have a syringe with a very small hole, it gets harder to push fluid through. So when we talk about the damping, if we're going to increase the damping, we're talking about closing the restriction on the hole. So you'll see that as a plus sign, or it'll be talked about as closed. Alternatively, if we want to look at a larger hole, we'll be talking about reducing the damping, or the minus sign when we get to the bike, and that will be in a fully, say, open position. Again, reminder, clockwise is always going to give us increased, and anti-clockwise is going to give us decreased, both on the rear and the front. So as we look at the rear springs, we've got compression sitting on the top here and rebound on the bottom. Both have 5 settings, so there'll be 4 clicks as you work through. So 5 settings in between those 4 clicks. Again, anti-clockwise, we're now in the fully open position. So if we want to increase, we would just go up by the level of clicks. I think from the factory they set them 2 in. And that's how they come sort of at a midpoint. Same on the rebound, but bear in mind here that again, we're going to be looking up the shock. This sort of confuses some people. So it is still clockwise to increase that rebound. And then you'll see the plus symbol is actually written on here, which keeps it nice and handy for us. So we can back that all the way down to no rebound added, and again go up a couple of clicks. I think that's where the factory leaves it here. Again, as always on the back, jump straight over and make exactly the same adjustments on this shock as well. It's always good though to try and align the rebound and the compression. You don't want to have one fully open and one fully closed. It's going to give you a weird feel. But the best way is to get out there, go for a ride. Obviously, this is nice and easy to do while you're out there. Ride the same bit of road several times with a few bumps in it and see what you prefer. Let's go have a look at the front. We're going to find our front damping settings on the right, top of the right fork. First of all, we can look at compression. And again, similar, same tool as we did on the preload side. If we put this on here, if we go full anti-clockwise, we will wind that compression all the way off. It's a little bit hard filming and wrenching at the same time here, but we can wind that all the way off. Now that I've turned that into a full open position, again, I can mark at the top here at 12 o'clock, and that way, using the wrench I can see exactly how many turns I'm getting as I play with the compression. From that fully open position, we have 8 turns. I think from the factory, they put it about 2 turns from open. So that's where it was when you probably picked up the bike, but yeah, 8 turns to play with. I'm going to put about 3 turns from open just to set this one up for now. So Rebound is a lot easier. You can see that we're going to use a flathead screwdriver in the top section here, and you can actually see that there's a marking that comes off of that pointing to the 1. So we've got 10 clicks on this one. 1 is fully open or decreased. So I've just moved this around to setting number 6, and we'll see how we go from there. So there you go. We've got some settings to go out and give this bike a run now and see how it handles. I would always write down how many turns from open that you're putting onto the bike. Just throw that in your phone. That way you've always got it with you, you know where you're at. If you ever lose those marks on there or you lose count, just wind it back to fully open again and start turning back from there. At least you know how many turns you're at last time, and you can do that same calculation again. When you're out there, you know, rebound and compression are something that you want to dial in as you go. And I mentioned before about doing that one section of road. So pretty easy on the back, no tools needed. But if you just take your spanner and your screwdriver when you're out for a ride, and yeah, you'll be able to, you know, dial those in as you go and just get it set up perfectly for you. Thank you very much for watching this video. That pretty much brings us to a wrap. Hope you learned something on it. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comments. I will get back and answer you. If you've got any suggestions for me or anything you thought I missed there or could have done better, I'd love to hear that as well. Yeah, it's how we're all learning, so please put those in the comments. If you're a suspension guru out there, love to hear from you. Really hope you guys are out enjoying these 101 Scouts, or if you're just looking at buying one, at least you got to see a little bit more of the capability today. Thanks again for watching. Really appreciate you doing that. Keep your 2 wheels down out there and enjoy the Scouts.